Thank you, Mr. President.
Welcome.
I have a lot of questions. But you answered a number of them. Let me start off by asking you one. In the video we talked about the arc of history in Guatemala. And certain things weren't said in the video, but we can talk about them now. The coup that defeated your father's successor was, as I mentioned in my remarks, an iconic event in the Cold War, often cited as CIA intervention on behalf of a large United States corporation. I don't think there's any dispute about that. And we go the full arc, almost 80 years later, you're in a situation where you've been elected, and there was a fight to have you seated as the president. In fact, your inauguration day was delayed 9 hours, I think, so that you could actually get to the point where you could take the oath of office. And one of the big actors, maybe the biggest influence in helping you get there, was the United States government. Obviously, indigenous people and other people in your country supported you tremendously. But I'm interested in your view of that arc of history. We'll get to what's happening now. But until a year ago, let's say, how do you make sense of that in the arc of history? United States involvement, hemisphere views of how the hemisphere should decide for itself on who its government should be.
Well, precisely because history is history. What happened in 1944 was in a very different world context. It was the beginning of the Cold War. There was an ideological confrontation. And the level of understanding of what was going on in the continent was very different for the United States. There were the coalitions that were being formed in Latin America were very different. And so that at some point, the United States in 1954, but along the process, failed to see that actually what was going on in Guatemala was that what the revolutionary governments were trying to do is to establish the basic foundations for a democratic society, one in which you have rule of law, but you also have social justice and benefiting everybody. But remember that we were coming out of a regime that was basically an unfiltered version of, 19th century despotism that had gone up until 1944. So along this process, what has been very clear is that this time we were up in front, very determined to make this a fight for democracy and social justice at the same time. We believe that there can't be democracy if you don't have social justice, and you cannot have social justice if you don't have democracy. We stand firmly behind that. We made it very clear, and we rallied all the people behind us. And although our opponents tried to present what we were trying to do as, oh, this is a bunch of radical communists, God haters, whatnot. I mean, they invented everything, and with artificial intelligence also quite creatively. It didn't work. It didn't work because we had, on the one hand, very strong support from the people in Guatemala. The indigenous peoples took the lead to go to the street and defend. And they were saying, we're defending democracy. They were not defending me as a leader. They were defending their right to say who should be the leader. And then society followed their lead. But we also had a very vigilant international community, one that was actually really realizing what was going on. The role of the OAS was fundamental, first of all, in certifying that the elections were clean and transparent. Second, in accompanying the transition process and checking on every attempt that they were making at trying to criminalize and judicialize the results in order to prevent us from taking office, attempts that they're still doing, by the way. And then countries like the United States very clearly identified this is not a matter of left and right. This is not an issue of a Cold War context. What we are defending here is democracy against a new type of authoritarianism, which is the one that derives from corruption and organized crime. So, and I think that was what happened, and that makes a whole difference.
Okay, so at that time, when you're going through that struggle of being seated, then Senator Marco Rubio was very supportive, as was Senator Cardin
Yep.
in the Senate, in supporting you sitting and then being allowed to govern. You are very clear about your support still for Taiwan, which, and as you are for, if I'm not mistaken, about your support for Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Which is not a common position amongst many heads of state in Latin America. So I'm wondering if you still feel, I think now Secretary of State Rubio is visiting you in a week.
About
a week's time.
About a week's time.
Do you think that the past support and the fact 2 other positions that you're taking will come into play in the conversations that you have with him? And how do you what do you expect from those conversations? And parenthetically, with his boss, who is talking about territorial expansion in your neighborhood, Panama, for example. What do you expect out of those conversations?
Well, I think that we have a very clear agenda, common agenda with the United States, in which there are a lot of issues that we have to consider how to address in common, because working together is going to be best in order to address and resolve them. First and foremost, of course, the issue of immigration. The changes in policy that the United States is taking might mean that many people, many Guatemalans that are currently in the United States are going to be returning to our country. And what we're doing is we're organizing ourselves in order to try to assist this process. We have a strategy in which we have our consular section in the United States is working in order to protect and accompany Guatemalans that reside in the United States, providing information and legal assistance and so on and so forth. But we are also working to allow dignified return and dignified reintegration, and we're working together so that we can have mechanisms so that they can access, well, we can plan and map what they are doing and identify skills that then we can use so that we don't see our returnees as a challenge, but as an opportunity to our economy. And some people that can actually, if we do this right, can help us engage and make our economy grow. So that's a challenge that we have. And we have the discussions with the United States are going to be around managing this flow, which, by the way, we also do in coordination with the other countries, because we have conversations with Mexico and the other Central American countries on coordinating efforts and positions on this. There's a second big issue that we have with the United States, which is security around particularly international organized crime, drug trafficking, but also people and species and whatnot. And here we have been collaborating very strongly. We believe that organized crime is one of the biggest dangers to democracy. If you allow it to actually collude with the political system. So we are fighting very hard. We have, I think that this year we tripled the number of the tons of cocaine that were detained and the number of fields of marijuana and cocaine that have been destroyed. And it is because, not because we are following somebody's instruction, but because we see in this activities actually a very clear danger to our democracy. And then we have the economy, in which we have in the United States one of our main economic partners, and we need to work together in how to do it. So within that agenda, what we're going to do is we're going to basically, what we're doing is saying, okay, so this is what we are sharing in terms of these particular items, and we need to start discussing how we're going to manage them. But not, I mean, our intention is to come with very concrete proposals on the different areas and not wait so that there can be then a reaction. So we know that there is going to be a change, but the fact that we have been working since my election with congressmen, the Senate, in Congress, representatives on both sides of the aisle, we believe that this is going to be important to enable us to just continue with the smooth transition.
Okay, let's pick up on that topic of crime. You know, your next door neighbor has his view of how to deal with gangs and crime, and in El Salvador, and a large measure, or the base of his policy, has been mass incarceration, and very, very often, according to many international groups of international jurists and the like, with a suspension of basic legal rights, habeas corpus and the like. You have explicitly distinguished your approach from his approach. Can you explain? And I should add, and he seems to be showing some at least short-term results in the decline of crime, which has endeared him to a number of people and sectors throughout the hemisphere. Back to the question, you have distinguished your approach from his. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, first of all, we have to recognize that the cartography of crime in El Salvador, or the nature of crime in El Salvador, is very different to the nature of crime in Guatemala. Actually, in El Salvador, crime was very much driven by gangs, which explained most of the criminal activity in the country. In Guatemala, gangs are a small factor in crime compared to other factors such as organized crime, drug trafficking, and extortion gangs. So it's a very different scenario. So in order to cope with a very different scenario, you just have to design your own mechanisms and measures, which is what we have been doing. We have very clearly identified the need to strengthen the presence of the police forces in the streets, and that's why we, as a goal, we want to hire 12,000 new policemen into the police force by the end of our mandate. We have already had, I think, 4,000 now this year. That's number one. Number two, we are taking control of our jails, because the prisons were completely in the hands of criminals. I mean, I don't know if anybody of you follows Guatemala, you will see the story about a jail that is called Infiernito, which the ministry, we decided to go inside, take everybody out, and then look what was going on. They had a swimming pool, they had a zoo, they had fiber optic coming into the beds
sounds
of
like Pablo
everybody.
Escobar. Sounds like Pablo Escobar.
It is exactly. They owned, they were controlling, and from inside the prison, they were conducting the extortion rackets outside. So we went in, we wiped everything, we just reformed the whole thing, and then we brought everybody in a prison that now really is not, a university of crime, but it's actually really a place where you have to pay your dues to society, and it's working already, because in the region where this jail was operating, the number of extortions came down, and I'm fighting crime in general. So we are doing it in our own way. We can tell you that homicides have come down in our country in the first year, that it's back into a historic descending trend that had been interrupted. Now we're back into that direction, that we've had descent, lower numbers in every category of crime, with the exception of extortion, which is a big problem that we're still tackling, and that we are doing this in full respect to legal and constitutional rights, because we believe that if you want to, if you're claiming that you want to rescue democratic institutions, you need to know that you cannot take shortcuts, that you need to respect the rule of law, even if it makes it harder for you to deal with these issues.
Is that something that you think you can put a dent in, or win, however you want to define win, short, medium, and long term, without greater coordination amongst your neighbors in the hemisphere? You had mentioned in the issue of the deportations, that deportees coming back from the United States, that there is a lot of conversation going on amongst your neighbors and the region about how to coordinate responses.
Right.
Correct, right? But one of the criticisms on the drug file is, and I guess also because of the transnational nature of it, that if it's not addressed on a transnational basis, that anything you do is going to have a limited effect. What's your thought about that?
No, we agree completely. That's why we are very, I don't remember the name, there's an acronym, ZBACS, but I don't remember, but we are working in establishing bilateral working groups with every one of our neighboring countries, work in which security institutions work together to address and coordinate actions addressing, the criminal threats that we have. So the Minister of Interior of Guatemala and people in the police and other institutions meet with their counterparts in Honduras or in El Salvador or in other places. Some of these groups, they had been existent but have been dormant, so we are reviving them in order to have the coordination. But there are also efforts at getting larger regional coordination, where some of these countries sit together, like Honduras, Mexico, and Guatemala, to discuss, for example, the issue of supporting migrants in the state of Texas. We actually have an agreement between the three countries in which we are providing consular backup to each other in the state of Texas, and it's a model that we are exploring to see if we can expand it elsewhere.
And do you think that coordination is the seed for greater regional coordination? Or there's been many, many attempts at creating regional organization, the OAS, but just amongst Central and South American and Caribbean countries, it's never gone anywhere. Well, more or less, right? There have been attempts. This coordination now, given the dire circumstances, do you think that's the seed that will finally get greater coordination on a number of issues, or are we going too fast on that?
I think that this is a moment in which you need to work with what you have and be very clear that the possibilities to establish large level coordinations are still limited. I'm speaking about the Central American space. We have a complete framework that establishes a process of gradual integration of the Central American countries, in which countries like the Dominican Republic, Panama have joined and are participating. But there is a fundamental problem in the region, and it's a non-democratic country, which stands in contrast to the democratic nature, Nicaragua, just not to mention the name, and stands in contrast.
Just between us.
Yeah,
Yes,
and it stands in contrast to the principles that we signed on the Protocol of Tegucigalpa, where we said that basically this was an agreement between democratic countries that were aspiring to democracy. So certainly one of them countries rolled back into this type of authoritarianism. And it's very difficult to advance on some areas when you have this type of situations, when we've had issues trying to elect a president, the secretary of the Central American Integration Commission, because it was the turn of Nicaragua. Nicaragua didn't want to present somebody that was electable. There was a lot of issues. But on the other hand, we know that we should not allow, just throw everything away. And we know that we have to work to advance on coordinating on economic matters, coordinating on the borders. We're working with Honduras and with El Salvador to coordinate and foster international commerce and have better coordinated and integrated aduanas, customs offices at the borders, and so on and so forth. So we continue the contacts, and we know that we have to do this because at some point this anomaly is going to be resolved, and then we will be able to pick up again and continue working towards a more integrated Central American.
Okay, two more questions. You mentioned in your comments about why your fight, your battle, your challenges in Guatemala are important well beyond your borders. At the same time, there's a current of thinking in Latin America, you know very well, that has some currency amongst people of being actively neutral in the world. You have not chosen that. Certainly, we mentioned and discussed earlier, Taiwan, Ukraine. You talked about your non-support or disdain or rejection of what's in Nicaragua, and you said it about Venezuela, elsewhere. What is your understanding or feeling about this concept of active neutrality amongst Latin American countries?
I think that you have to be very careful internationally to play a role where you do not encourage forces for polarization very clearly. And that's one of the threats that we have at the international system at this point in time. But at the same time, you have to do it in a way where you stand clear on terms of the principles that you're attached and that you're working for. We believe in a multilateral system. We believe in the need to foster and develop democracy. And we want to be seen as a country that is very clearly taking sides on that, while at the same time, we are very aware that we should not play into any type of polarizing or creating the type of antagonism that should not be, that can only lead to further tension in the international system. So be clear about where you stand, but with those principles in hand, work to find a solution and a peaceful solution.
And certainly your background as a diplomat leads you to believe that solutions are possible. In most cases.
Beyond being a diplomat, look, after being a diplomat, I went to work in international organizations. And I worked for 25 years in a field which is called peace building. Based upon our experience in Guatemala, where I started working, then I went to work at regional level, and then went to Geneva, and then I worked internationally and many other places. You don't work on peace building if you're not an optimist that people can change. I'm sorry. It's if I wouldn't believe that people can change, that the world can go to a better place, that we can make life of countries and people better, I don't know. I would be probably doing something very different than what I'm doing today. I don't know, painting, or I don't know. But I would be engaged in trying to do.
Writing books.
Well, I've already been doing that.
Well, that's what I'm saying, so I can see that. Let me ask you one final question. There are parallels between when your father came to office and when you came to office, 80 years difference. Yeah. What lessons did you learn from his experience that you carry with you in what you're doing now?
Well, I think that he was a man of principles. He really lived by his principles, believed in his principles. Before coming, my father was not a politician. He just, by mistake, ended up being president. He was a teacher. Really. You look into history. He was a university professor when he was called, hey, we have a revolution and we want you to be our candidate. And he was there and he won with 86% of the vote. So, and there he went and he kept his principles when he was in office. And he kept the same principles when he lived afterwards, because he was a very young president. He was 40. It took me a lot of more time to get there. Yeah. So, so I think that he managed to do what he wanted to do because he had a clarity on the type of principles that he believed were important. And those were the ones that, guided him along a very complex, a very convoluted, a very, explosive period in the life of our country, but to make huge achievements at the same time. So I take from him, well, first of all, the responsibility to be true to our principles, and then understand that what we are doing is going to affect the life of many, many, many people. So we should be very careful about what we're doing.
I lied a few minutes earlier. I said I only had 2 more questions. I have one more. What can Canada do to help? We have members of Parliament here. Others will know about this and watch the video. What would you like to tell them about how they can help you and what they should know?
Well, I think that Canada is a democratic nation and has been very strongly fighting for democracy, not only in the world, but in the continent, and very clearly from the OAS and other places. I think that there is an important element in knowing what we are doing and providing the political support that we believe is important in order to, move ahead, particularly in the quite choppy international waters that we're going to be navigating in this era. But also, come and invest.
Invest.
Come and invest. Help us develop our economy. There's huge potential in the country. We have natural resources, and by the way, the Guatemalan people have an incredible work ethic. This is something that I've been learning from listening to people in the United States and other places. They're really, really very appreciated in terms of their working ethic. And we're a growing country. Our economy grew, 3.7% this year, 1.7% inflation. And we're expected to grow further, 4 or more this year. 5 is a little bit too greedy. 4, let's hope. But we need investment. We need to create more jobs for people. We at least 50%, more than 50% of our population is living under the line of poverty. And the only way to resolve that is expanding the economy, increasing production, creating new jobs. So if you want to give us a good hand, come and invest.
Mr. President, thank you so much for this conversation.